Well, thanks all for joining here today. My name is Wade Crowfoot, and I serve as our California Natural Resources Secretary. And if you are tuning in to today's discussion, you are joining what's called our Secretary Speaker Series, where we bring together leaders and big thinkers outside of our own agency to talk to us about issues we all care about. We've had about 10 speaker series at this point, or 10 events within our speaker series, each focused on a different topic. Beginning in March, as a result of the pandemic, we moved our speaker series from our downstairs natural resources headquarters auditorium to online. And I'm really glad to share that we've actually expanded those who can participate by bringing this online and sharing it broadly for all to participate. The last several speaker series events we've had since the stay-at-home order have actually attracted several hundred people. And so I would imagine today we have an equally large and diverse group of participants. These discussions are ultimately about sharing perspectives and interacting and engaging in dialogue. So everybody here today is going to have an opportunity to ask questions or share observations as they see fit. We're going to be joined by three really distinguished panelists who were central to our topic today, and then give you all an opportunity to join the conversation by asking questions a little bit later in the session. And in just a moment, actually, James, if we could bring up the slide to let people know how to ask questions, that would be helpful. So as I understand it, at the bottom of your screen within Zoom, there is an icon labeled Q&A. And in order to ask a question, you log onto that Q&A or click onto that Q&A and ask your question. And then those questions go directly to panelists. Because we're using Zoom for a very large event format, we don't have the functionality of a smaller Zoom call. In other words, observers or participants that are not the panelists are automatically muted, as well as their video being muted. But the Q&A, rest assured, will get to us, and I'll work to integrate as many questions as I can. And then James, just because you've got the voice of God within this, if you have any other tips that you want to share as it relates to Q&A, feel free to share them now.
No, I think you were pretty clear about that, Wade.
All right. A big thanks at the top of this discussion to James Pierce, our IT guru in the Resources Agency, for helping facilitate this, and Lizzie Williamson, Deputy Secretary, my colleague, who helps produce these. So again, the Q&A icon on the bottom of your screen will allow you to type in a question or observation at any point during this discussion. Thanks, James, for that screen, and we'll go back to the full view. So we're here, obviously, to talk about the Marine Protected Area movement and effort. And the impetus of this discussion was a book that was recently published called Beyond Polarization: Public Process and the Unlikely Story of California's Marine Protected Area. And it immediately caught my eye when I became aware of it, because so many issues that we navigate on natural resource management involve very different perspectives, and oftentimes get characterized as a zero-sum, winner-takes-all game. One side wins, the other side loses. And within our Natural Resources Agency, we are working to steward natural resources in partnership with all stakeholders in a way that's balanced. And so really understanding that this book looked at the MPA process with an emphasis around how did it actually get done and what lessons can we learn was really, really attractive to me. And we're really glad to have the author of the book, Professor Steve Yaffi from the University of Michigan, on as part of this discussion. And in just a little while, we'll ask him to sort of set the table for this discussion with by sharing broad findings that he explains in his book. But let me make a few points about, and then let me just say that we're deeply thankful to have Megan Van Pelt and Meg Caldwell joining as key panelists in this discussion. Obviously, there were many leaders that helped the MPA network become what it is. And so any number of folks could have participated as panelists. And we're really thankful to have Megan and Meg. Many who are watching may know that Meg serves as Deputy Director of the Oceans Program at the Packard Foundation and is a real expert on the intersection of science and policy. And that Megan Van Pelt is Executive Director of the Resingini Rancheria tribal community in Northern California, and importantly, the North Regional Tribal Representative on the MPA's statewide leadership team. So we'll hear from Professor Yaffi first, sort of laying out what he learned about observing this process over time. And then we'll hear both from Megan and Meg, their perspectives on this all. And then we'll mix it up and get into conversation. Let me, before I turn it over to Steve, make a few points about our marine protected areas and this effort to both create them and then operationalize them. One is, this discussion is not about declaring victory. The MPA networks are very much a work in progress. And in fact, very soon we will be engaging in this decadal review, which is this review after 10 years' time to really understand both the effectiveness of the areas as well as the impacts of the areas. So we're not in this conversation concluding the inevitable success of the MPAs or necessarily the effectiveness or impacts. That's very much will be assessed here to come. That being said, the establishment of this 124 place network is a global accomplishment, and it's a global conservation accomplishment that brought people together with very different and frankly opposing perspectives to actually establish what is this global best practice in oceans management and conservation. Point number two, we recognize that what we'll hear from Professor Yaffi is his perspective as an outside expert observing the process. And there are multiple perspectives within this process. Our goal with this discussion is not to talk about or establish a history of the MPAs, but to really share what we've learned together, and with viewers of this discussion and participants, hear your own perspectives. A big shout out to participants that actually got us to where we are today. First on my list is the Department of Fish and Wildlife within our agency. That was there in the pre-MPA, the establishment of the MPA, and is playing a central role in operationalizing the MPA. Likewise, our Ocean Protection Council within our agency playing an important role, and so many stakeholders, whether you're a commercial fisherman or a fishing association or a nonprofit conservation group, or as we'll hear about from Megan, tribal communities. It really did take leaders from so many different perspectives to establish this network. And we're excited to talk more about that today. So let me then now turn it over to Steve Yaffi. I asked him, I joked around with him, what is a professor from the state of Michigan, a landlocked state, doing focusing on oceans? And he reminded me that Michigan is not a landlocked state. It has the world's largest network of freshwater lakes. And I actually should know this because I'm a native Michigander. And I'm really proud that my dad, who's a retired professor at Michigan, actually served with Steve Yaffi in a remarkable small world story. So Steve, thank you for your interest in California policy and the MPA. Thank you for writing this book to really stimulate a discussion of what we've learned. And let me turn it over to you to explain what a Michigander is doing studying ocean policy in California, and given your choice to do that, what you have learned.
Okay, thanks, Wade, and thanks very much for the invitation to be part of this event. Let's see, yes. So, I've been involved for a very long time in research and writing about environmental conflict and public policy and how we can create better ways to make decisions that are informed by science and by diverse values. And along the way, I've worked on some really messy issues: the spotted owl controversy in the Pacific Northwest, marine ecosystem-based management around the world, wildlands conservation in California, among others. Actually, very few of these stories have been in Michigan. Most of my work has been in the American West, both terrestrial systems and aquatic. And I've come to believe that in order to be effective, you need to work at larger scales, at the ecosystem or regional scale. And the only way that you do that is to engage more people and more organizations, that is to work collaboratively. And in doing so, you can share information and diverse capabilities. And I think perhaps more important, you can build a sense of ownership in solutions on the part of the people who will be affected by decisions. For the last 20 years, I've tried to draw lessons from exemplars. That is, situations that people saw as success stories. And to be honest, it has become increasingly difficult to find uncontested images of success as our society has gotten more polarized. And instead of solving problems, we often see impasse and inaction and frustration. Well, the MLPA initiative tells a different story. And I got involved with the California MPAs pretty much accidentally. I was in attendance at a conflict resolution conference in Tucson in 2012, where 4 people who had been involved in the MLPA initiative shared a story about their experience. And they described the situation, the system way that you described, a set of 124 MPAs, 852 square miles of habitat patches running along the California coast, and a network whose parts were designed to interact with each other. And that's one of the unique aspects, I think, of the California system versus other places that are much more accreted sets of protected areas. They talked about the ways that the process led to a variety of outcomes, not just on the water. They led to significant organizational changes, including shifts in the skills and outlooks of state agencies, and changes in state policy, including what I think is a fundamental shift in the recognition of tribal sovereignty and rights. And as everyone knows, that happened in spite of intense conflict, major fiscal difficulties, and in a situation where the state agencies had already been unable 2 times to implement the law. So I'm sitting there in the conference and I'm wondering, how is this possible? How were they able to succeed? What strategies did they use? Are there lessons for other places from this story? And if nothing else, I felt that someone should capture the story in part to motivate people who feel, and it's sometimes hard not to feel this way, that working together effectively is no longer possible. So to make a long story short, I spent the last 7 years on the research and writing that went into Beyond Polarization. And that involved 150 hours of interviews with stakeholders and scientists and policymakers and funders who had been involved in the effort. It included watching hundreds of hours of recorded public meetings and capturing dialogue from the stakeholder discussions, which is an endeavor that I don't advise others to replicate, although you can find all that material on the California DFW website. And I wrote Beyond Polarization to focus on the strategic choices made by real people in the process, some of which worked and some of which blew up in their face. Process matters, and agency staff and those training to be in resource management positions can learn to do better. And that doesn't mean telling a fisheries biologist to go deal with the public without the kind of help that can be gleaned from stories like this. I think the book also tries to capture the drama and intensity of a complicated policy process as best as it can in print word. We can say that the legislature passed the MLPA, which then created a set of protected areas, but that would be an absurd simplification. It was people confronting each other on docks and in parking lots, negotiating intensely in hotel meeting rooms in San Rafael and Cambria and Eureka, It was political leaders and interest groups engaging richly in the process and incentivizing others to do so as well. It was agency staff and scientists being pushed out of their comfort zone to share power with others and to work with others to solve a problem. What I've done in the book is tried to shine a spotlight on all of their efforts and tell this saga of a piece of policy as a human story. So why did the initiative succeed? I'm going to provide 5 quick answers, which then we can explore more fully in discussion. And the first is that the law was framed as non-discretionary. In facilitation, we distinguish between whether questions and how questions. Whether new MPAs should be created versus how should we determine which should get created, in what places, in what form. And the MLPA settled the whether question. There would be MPAs. It might have taken the first regional process to sort that out when opponents were trying to relitigate that, but it was clear that there would be MPAs. And the process became a question of how to engage richly in finding places that protect values and avoid other areas that would obstruct other values. In addition, ecosystem protection was the clear priority of the law. Minimizing economic impacts was not required, which limited the power of MPA opponents. Minimizing economic impacts was a political requirement. There was strong politics behind that and strong substantive need to not harm things that didn't need to be harmed. But it was not an explicit legal one. And that led to much more balance than sometimes happens in these processes. Second, the process forced scientists to simplify what they almost always describe as extraordinarily complex systems in order to develop a set of rules of thumb, which then allowed the stakeholders themselves to create networks, to plan networks to meet science guidelines. That was empowering to the stakeholders. It enabled problem solving that was actually much more efficient because they could engage richly in it. I would say that along the way, a group of scientists became very effective at communicating science to policymakers and to real people. These are the Dr. Fauci's of the marine world, I guess. The process benefited also from the mandate in the law to use best readily available science, which cut down the opponent's ability to filibuster based on a demand for more information, which also happens a lot on these processes. It's not just best science, but best readily available science. Third, they invested in really good process. They contracted with skilled facilitators who had lots of tools. They used deadlines to keep the parties moving forward. The stakeholder process was set up to produce alternatives, not a consensus, which made it likely that all stakeholders could support one of the alternatives and no one could block a consensus choice. They ran the process sequentially through 4 regions so that they could learn from a previous process and adapt over time. Plus, since the issues and conditions in each of the regions along the California coast were so different, the process could be designed
Steve, I'm going to ask you to pause for a moment because you appear to have, we've lost audio connection to you. We were hearing you right until about 10 seconds ago. So I don't see you on mute right now. Can you try talking once again? No, still can't hear you. We were getting really good reception to you just until about 10 seconds ago. I may suggest well, can you try once more? And if we can't,
let me try now.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so It's
No
the
worries.
magic of Zoom, which those of us that are now doing remote teaching are learning a lot about.
Yeah. If I start waving my hands, it means we can't hear you again, but you sound really good. So please proceed. You were explaining the sequential nature of the regions.
Okay. I think the other dimension about that is that each of the regions are so unique and different in terms of the conditions and the people that are there and the issues, that the sequential nature allowed them to think about that and plan a process that would work considering that. I would say, and this is the second time I guess I've said it, only the first time that it's heard, is that there was an extraordinary amount of process, which was overpowering and exhausting at times. And sometimes they erred on providing too much information, which cut into deliberation time. One of the regions had 4 of the 7 meetings all on information provision, pushing out time that they needed to negotiate. Still, as someone who studies these kinds of collaborative processes, these efforts were run just about as well as they could be. All right, let me see if I can regain control here. Here we go. Fourth, none of this would have been possible without the unique public-private partnership established by the MLPA Initiative. It mobilized $35 million, which is a lot of money, but the partnership was not just about money and not just about funding a process. It injected a degree of flexibility and creativity that would not have been evident in the normal bureaucratic situation. They could turn around contracts in days, funds could be shifted to where they were needed. Achieving the process was the objective, not carrying out preset organizational procedures. In the design of the partnership, a really unique structure was created in the form of a policy level blue ribbon task force, whose function was to be an intermediary between the stakeholder process and the California Fish and Game Commission, who was and is the decider on this. It is the blue ribbon task force that is the group that Meg bravely served on through all 4 regions. And I think one of the values of the BRTF, one of the unique aspects of this, is that it insulated the stakeholder process from the sort of raw politics of the commission and vice versa. And it provided pre-negotiated proposals to the commission, which made them perhaps wiser than they would have been otherwise and made them hard to ignore. The partnership also managed the political environment. They recognized that what goes on at the table is largely a function of what is possible away from the table. And they work very hard at building and maintaining political will and engaging a full range of diverse players. Lastly, they mobilized energetic, talented people of all sorts. And critically, they created vehicles by which their energies could be captured. That is, they weren't just engaging energy into a black hole, but they actually were problem solving. And that included a phenomenal collaborative geographic information system whose product was not just maps, but it empowered people to create their own draft plans and shifted the group's focus from conflict across the table to joint problem solving. And I would say that having watched these meetings, I didn't live through the meetings as Meg and Megan did, but it was remarkable to see 100 people in a hotel meeting room, all intensely focused on 2 projected alternative MPA shapes, trying to adjust the boundaries to meet everyone's interests. There was a level of understanding and problem solving that's just really rare nowadays. So you can read more of the story in the book. But overall, I think that the effort got science, process, and people right. There were lots of stumbles, and the outcomes fully satisfied no one. Not all regions fully met the science guidelines. Some state officials were reluctant partners. The process at times could have used better information, particularly on the economic implications of alternatives. And some critical policy decisions, such as how to acknowledge and accommodate tribal use of marine resources, should have been made much earlier in the process to avoid some of the frustrations that were particularly evident through much of the North Coast process. Still, there are many lessons to be learned here. And the bottom line of the story, I think, is actually quite hopeful. People succeeded in accomplishing something big despite tough challenges. It's a story where government worked hand in hand with non-governmental partners to achieve success. It's a story about how people can make complicated decisions together, informed by real-world facts and diverse values, even in the highly polarized era that we find ourselves in. And I think it's a story that others can learn from, and one of which the citizens of California should be proud. So I'm not going to tell you that this process can be replicated at scale for all problems or even many problems, but I will tell you that elements of what went on here can and should be part of most resource problem solving processes and should be part of the state's best practices for resource management. And I'm happy to talk more about that if you'd like.
Great, Steve. Thanks so much. Lots of questions to ask you. I have to say that, I haven't cracked that many books written by professors since graduate school. And in part because sometimes they're heavily academic or theoretical. I have to compliment you on your book. I mean, your book is a story, as you say. I think, my own take is you applied a lot of analytical rigor to understanding the process and its results, but you wrote it in a really compelling way. So I expected to read a few pages of the introduction to know enough, and I'm halfway through the book. Compliments to you, and thanks for applying yourself to this process. How long was this book in the making again?
7 years.
7 years.
And I would say that there was a draft that was 40% larger. That was done about 2 years ago.
Wow.
So a lot of it was cutting it back, and it's still a long book. And it is a story, though, and that was the intent.
Good. Well, Megan, one of the last points that Steve made is on the lessons learned around really recognizing the leadership of tribal communities on stewarding the ocean environment and then effectively and adequately engaging them. From my perspective, we all know that since time immemorial, California tribal communities along the coast have been stewarding the fisheries and frankly, no more than we ever will about the environment in which we're working to protect. Yet it seems like early on, the state stumbled somewhat on really recognizing the centrality of tribes, and that it learned from lessons, and now is, I think, working to really ensure that tribal leadership is shaping the existing MPAs and whatever happened to the MPAs in the future. Can you share your perspective as a leader of a tribe that really is in that role of stewarding the environment and has engaged directly within the MPAs, sort of your perspective on lessons learned and what it means for the state actually truly partnering with tribal communities on co-management of natural resources and actually utilizing the traditional ecological knowledge of tribes?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that. So I think, a fundamental flaw or concern in the law itself was that tribal rights or tribes just in general were not acknowledged in the law. And so I think that was an initial challenge. And not only that, but just the whole concept behind marine protected areas is really about sort of removing people from the environment in order for the environment to sort of heal on its own. And that's really counterintuitive to, indigenous people's relationship with the land, right? So as you mentioned, since time immemorial, having that sort of intrinsic connection with the environment and really managing the environment to sort of the underlying ideas of MPAs is totally opposed to that, right? Or in opposition to that concept. It made it a real challenge to try to get across to the state the need to deconstruct that very thought in and of itself. And then you have the issues of, traditional law, right? So indigenous traditional knowledge is really passed down orally. It's held in stories and ceremony and within families at a village level, at a tribal level. But most of that law is not written down, right? And so That was also really a hard thing to express to policymakers, but also scientists and sort of legal experts to really say, how do you talk about managing a resource when it's not a law written down that can be just easily shared and expressed. So that was a real challenge of really getting them to understand that traditional law does provide protocols in place to ensure that sustainable management can continue and the environment can stay healthy and balanced. And then you have the issue of just tribal rights in general in the marine environment. So, tribes retain rights that they don't cede through a treaty or through other mechanisms. And then they retain any rights that Congress has not explicitly taken away. And so you have this interesting space in California, particularly in the marine environment, where tribes continue to assert those rights and through practice, right? And now through the formation of tribal governments, attempt to assert those rights formally. But the law does not really have a recognized space for that yet. And so California was sort of floundering a little bit with trying to look to their federal partners to give them guidance that really isn't there because that hasn't been sort of adjudicated or, otherwise addressed through legislation or others. So I think those were some of the main challenges that we found. And then also just, tribes having the capacity to even be engaged in these processes. So that was a big piece too of trying to pull tribes together to stand with a stronger sort of unified voice and try to help lend information and expertise across tribes who may not have capacity to really engage, but their rights and interests were still going to be affected.
Megan, was there a turning point in which or at which time you felt like the state was learning that lesson and working to correct the failure of the exclusion of tribal communities, for example, in the original law? And where do you think it, frankly, stands right now? And if there's areas for improvement, I'd appreciate any candid suggestions.
Yeah, certainly. So I think, the North Coast was a very different process. Like you had mentioned, there was really strong tribal engagement. And so, we really pushed hard to try to be represented on the regional stakeholder group, on the Blue Ribbon Task Force, tried to sort of work with the scientists. But it really wasn't until sort of the end, one of the final meetings of the Blue Ribbon Task Force, there was quite a large group of Indigenous people that came together across many tribal nations to come and stand together and sort of speak their mind through protest in that meeting. And I feel like at that point it was like, okay, this, the state needs to try to address this or this might not go through. And so I think from that, and the leadership of the former Secretary Laird, and you've continued that leadership, of really, how do we try to acknowledge these uses and still move forward with protection? And so there was a creative sort of approach with the tribal take exemption within MPAs. And so that's somewhat of a space that's been created. We still have a lot of work to do there. But it also led to consultation policies within the Resources Agency and other state agencies and departments, which has really helped foster more communication between the state and tribes. We also now have a tribal committee as part of the Fish and Game Commission, and who recently has adopted a vision and definition for co-management. So I think, the space for those conversations are starting to happen or be created. And, through those, stronger relationships are built and more sort of common understanding of where we're all coming from can happen. So I am hopeful. And, we also were able to be involved. Tribes were in the baseline monitoring project and got to spearhead a traditional knowledge project through that. And also get involved in a couple of the strictly kind of science projects. And now we are looking to be involved in long-term monitoring by piloting a tribal marine stewards network. So again, trying to work on building capacity and look to essentially co-manage with the state. And so I'm really optimistic by those efforts, and the hope for where that's going to lead. And it is a slow and difficult process sometimes, and a lot of education and re-education, but it's important, and that's what needs to happen. So, and I think it's opportunities like this to, platforms like this to tell the story, because it is such a unique story to tell. And I am hopeful for where we're at in that relationship and continuing to build upon that.
Well, big thanks to you for serving in the leadership role right now. And I do want to acknowledge former Secretary Laird. I remember when I was appointed to this role, I asked him for sort of key insights. And he said, sometimes you have to identify the thorniest problems and jump in directly and personally. And I think he is really proud of the role that the agency played in really navigating those tough issues and bringing the state along to recognizing the centrality of tribes. So big shout out there. And then now, 8 years on, this fall we'll be hiring our first assistant secretary for tribal affairs to really institutionalizing the consultation with sovereign tribes and the co-management of natural resources. So we're really excited about that. I want to shift to Meg, and if Steve is a long timer on MPAs, you may have him beat. You've really been there since the beginning, including, as Steve said, serving on the Blue Ribbon Task Force. So I want to ask you two questions, Meg. The first is, given your experience in that whole process and the ups and downs, sort of what are key conclusions you draw or lessons learned? And then secondly, now you find yourself as a leader of one of the foundations to invest in this process. And this public-private partnership is so promising, and then to some people so fraught, because what is the role of the non-governmental players? So I'd love to get your perspective on that as well, which is how do you structure public-private partnerships to bring that creativity and those resources to a public process in a way that maintains the transparency and integrity of the public process?
So just a few reflections on the MLPA initiative, partly underscoring what Steve and Megan have also said. I just can't underscore enough the importance of the protests that Megan referred to. It was essential for all of us in the room, the agency representatives who were in the room, the task force members, other stakeholders, to hear and listen, actively listen to the very legitimate grievances that were being discussed. And that whatever number of hours it was went by kind of in a flash, because it was so powerful, and tribal leaders surrounded the room and gave us the very clear message that you need to hear this. This is critical. And it took the state a very long time to really respond. And I am, so heartened by what has happened since then. And I know we have a long way to go. And one of the areas that I definitely know we still have to do a lot of work on is where Western science meets traditional knowledge. And I don't think we ever did come up with a good solution to honoring that traditional knowledge, honoring the confidentiality of it, ensuring that the joint fact-finding took that traditional knowledge into account appropriately. So that's something I look forward to hearing about, the power sharing and the knowledge sharing that can go forward and still respect the important, cultural features of traditional knowledge that just can't be broken. The other thing that I would love to just underscore is that, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So the process was very, intellectually developed. It was, it ended up, being referred to as a gold standard. And and yes, it was an extraordinary process, as inclusive as one could imagine at the time, although could have done a much better job with the tribal communities. That is where we fell short, for sure. But the culture evolved over the 4 regions, and we had a lot of repeat players who stood up for interests statewide that were critical. And we generated a culture of speaking truth to power. We generated a culture of joint fact-finding. We generated a culture of problem solving in that process, and the facilitators were essential to that, for sure. And I just think there's no going back. We've now set expectations for the state about how resources and decisions around resources can and should be made. And I'm really excited about the fact that it's a new model and it's a new day. I don't know, you want me to talk about public-private partnerships? Wade, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Steve had one of his 5 sort of secrets of success, the flexibility and resources that public-private partnerships brought. And that's fairly unique in the resource management space. So maybe talk a little bit about the genesis and then sort of what it brings. And then I know I saw one of the protest signs, suggested, real concerns around sort of the secretive nature of non-governmental organizations participating. So, how do you protect against that? So all those questions.
Wow, that's a lot. So I have to say that I wasn't really in the room at the origin of the public-private partnership. I was, working at Stanford, the law school, and just beginning my tenure on the California Coastal Commission. But what I can speak to is what I saw as a participant in the process. And what I saw, and now I can kind of add my reflections being at the Packard Foundation, is that the foundations were really just interested in the law getting implemented. There were no expectations around how much would get protected, how it would be protected. They were interested in an inclusive process that was informed by facts and that involved people jointly looking at information and knowledge and engaging in constructive problem solving. So there were times, I can assure you, late at night when we were still in the meeting room, where it sure would have been nice to have someone put a finger on the scale for us, but that didn't happen. And I think that is because the philosophy, certainly of the Packard Foundation, is that public process is pretty sacred space, and it needs to be inclusive. It needs to be respectful of those who are going to be most affected by the decisions that are being made. And so I definitely felt that in the rooms where I sat, and definitely have that perspective sitting at the foundation now. The money had to be, there was not sufficient money for such an inclusive process in the state itself and its own coffers. So,
and it happened in a time, part of it happened in a real economic downturn, right?
Yeah. So if not now, when? The foundations exist to serve the public, basically. The money is a public good. And so what better place to invest than in implementation of such an important law, and to try to support a process that did it justice.
That's really helpful. I want to ask you all about trust for a moment, because, the collaboration is the watchword of at least part of the success, but then collaboration requires some level of trust. And when you read in the book, the levels of disagreement and people came to the table highly polarized. And so given, if we measure polarization in the national political climate, we're probably at a peak. Maybe starting with Steve, what are critical elements to build trust? Applied, from this instance to potentially other issues.
Well, I think that trust doesn't come easy. And I think that many collaborative processes, including this one, I wouldn't say necessarily that there was trust until either at all or, early on in the process, that it comes from the ability to work together by building relationships. I think breaking down stereotypes of opponents, of basically face-to-face encounters, of effective time spent listening and learning in a very human way is helpful. I think that processes that take people out to look at and engage in a problem rather than just operate across a table helps to break down some of those stereotypes and those identities, those tribal identities. Pardon the tribal reference, but in a more narrow kind of way. So I think part of it is the process to make this more personal and engaging, and it takes time to do that. I think that creating a process that allows for an exploration of joint problem solving, this gets back to the zero-sum nature of what you were talking about. I think if you came to this process, as some did, thinking that there wouldn't be MPAs, then this was a zero-sum process from their standpoint, because there was going to be MPAs. But
Right.
if you came to the process recognizing that the law said there's going to be MPAs, and where we put them in depends on trade-offs and values, then you have to explore those things. So I think trust builds over time. I would say that I suspect that the investments in implementation activities and in pilot programs and in ongoing collaboratives that occurred after 2012 have perhaps helped to build more trust than what was going on kind of in the process. But to be honest, the politics surrounding the process is always pulling away from that trust, because what it's doing is that there were coalitions of fishing and consumptive groups and conservation groups that were meeting simultaneously and plotting strategy around. And their incentive is to pull things in their direction. The collaborative is then trying to overcome some of that and use that as a positive force.
Thanks, Steve. Megan or Meg, any thoughts on the role that trust did or didn't play, and why each of you trust enough in the process to actually spend a lot of your work lives involved in implementing it?
Yeah, I could speak to that a little bit. I don't know if trust is the right word or more respect. I think respect was what was developed through the process. Just to kind of underscore what Steve said about, really trying to see things from other people's perspectives, having enough respect to, sit down and have those difficult conversations. Even if someone, we didn't really want to hear what they had to say, you at least give them the time and your attention that you treat them how you want to be treated, so to speak. But I think it's really about respect. And we had a unique opportunity on the North Coast, as sort of was mentioned earlier, to see what happened in the other processes, in the other regions. So, we sort of up here, and being, I would say, a much smaller community as a whole and much more interrelated and connected, I think, we really tried to find ways to develop relationships early on before the initiative ever even really came up here. We knew they were coming, but so trying to really focus on what's good for the community and not what's good for one particular user group. So I think respect is really, what was sort of what grew out of that. And that includes, with state representatives, right? And all that's really comes down to having more face-to-face time together, getting to know each other on a personal level. And, we continue to try to do that. But I think that's a big sort of piece of it. It's just the process forced people to come together that wouldn't normally and have difficult conversations that they normally wouldn't have. And we all were on equal footing in that process. So it sort of created a space to at least respect that another person was representing another group just as you were, right? So I think the initiative sort of fostered that in that sense, at least among, I would say, the stakeholder group and sort of the folks that were represented there.
That's really helpful. We've got some questions coming in from participants. And again, if you are tuning in here and listening and you want to share a question or a perspective, please type it into the Q&A icon that you can click at the bottom of your screen, and we'll begin being able to ask those questions. But before we do, Meg, any thoughts as it relates to that question of really establishing respect or trust within the process to engage participation?
Yeah, I'll just add that there were some very well-considered approaches that were used and only alluded to in the book, but we spent a lot of time eating together and drinking beer together between the task force members, with the SAT, with the regional stakeholders in every single region. And there's just nothing like sitting down and having a meal with someone and talking with them about who they are, you know, what matters to them in life, not always talking about the marine protected areas. And that was a vehicle for both establishing some trust and also building on some mutual respect. And so no matter what you do in resource management, don't forget the beer. It's really important.
Yeah, people breaking bread and even drinking alcohol together. Yeah, I've heard that in other areas, whether it's water policy or forest management. So obviously MPAs, we're talking about a story that didn't end with the publication of this book. And as I said at the top of our discussion, MPAs are a work in progress, and we can't yet make conclusions on their effectiveness in the first 10 years until that decadal review is completed. But that being said, one of our participants asks, how effective have MLPs been, or MPAs, these protected areas, and has the overall program met its objectives? Let me turn it to you, Meg, first. How do we answer that? Are we midstream? Are there things that we know as it relates to effectiveness? When will we find out, and how will that shape the future?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll just reflect back on sort of the first 5-year review that I went to, and that was for the Central Coast region. And as many people know who were involved in the process, with each region, with each marine protected area, we had a sense of which species would be most likely to benefit. And so that set some expectations around seeing from monitoring results whether or not they were benefiting and improving in population size, also size of individual, many indicators. And we started seeing that in the Central Coast region. Not all species respond at the same rate because they have different life histories. We'd already seen that in the Channel Islands. And so just from a sort of ecosystem standpoint, we started to see those kinds of really positive indicators. But I want to go to another kind of measure of success, if I can, and that is the profound support that Californians have for our marine protected areas and for coastal conservation in general. And the July Public Policy Institute of California survey just came out, the results, and it is absolutely overwhelming to see, you know, between 89 and 90% of Californians across north portion of the state, Central Coast area, inland areas are strongly supportive of these areas. So they're connecting with these special places. They're seeing recovery of these places, and they're telling us, they're telling leadership that they're important to their lives. And so that to me is another measure of success, that if we weren't seeing results, if we didn't think that these places were important, we would see a decline in support.
Fair point. Megan, how would you characterize the effectiveness of MPAs? Too early to tell? You know, cautious optimism, outright success?
I guess cautious optimism, I would say. We will see. And, I think that's the biggest challenge that the state has is just, sustaining long-term monitoring and what that means. And so, yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic. One of the things, though, I do think that sort of came from this with the tribe being involved in the baseline study is really being able to provide a space for tribal members to identify what they were concerned about, whether species or particular areas and all of that. So I think that will turn out to be pretty successful down the road to alerting the state to some species that really the state isn't monitoring that really might not be concerned for them. So I think in that way of providing more direct input from the tribal community in what the state's goals are and stuff and what should be monitored, I think it is a positive thing. And so I look forward to sort of seeing how MPAs are potentially positively impacting those particular species that are also culturally important.
Thank you for that. Steve, recognizing that this is not a situation where the process is done, the network is complete, and everybody goes home and leaves it there. In other words, it's still a work in progress. Given your expertise in these collaborative processes, what type of process needs to continue? How do you kind of tend to the garden to make sure that it's still growing? What do you observe as important parts of ongoing process to make sure, wherever MPAs land, that they're being as effective as they can be?
So my answer to the question is whether you have durable change, and the durability of the change is shown whether people continue to invest in it, in resources and time and energy and political will, whether you get the cultural changes ensconced in policy changes, which you have done, whether some of the cultural obstacles against MPA formation that were occurring through the story of the designation process are less so because of leadership changes, which from an outsider standpoint, you also have on the commission, in the state agencies, et cetera. So in my mind, you see durable change and you see that kind of investment. As to the collaborative processes, I think that you want to provide the opportunity for people to meaningfully engage in the implementation activities. And I think some things like the MPA Collaborative Network is trying to do that. And we'll see. I think it sounds like it's being successful in some places.
And the Collaborative Network is a sort of a nonprofit network of groups that are interested in MPAs wherever they are in the state?
Yeah, there are 14 collaboratives organized mostly at the county level, up and down the coast, that are kind of self-organizing, but there is a collaborative network that is an umbrella organization that is sort of serving to help them organize and to help them learn across them. I think that's a really positive kind of notion of how you maintain engagement through time and lead to adaptation. The fact that you're getting continued science, so we're going to learn through time is another positive sign. So I would say that many collaborative processes produce a plan, and that's it. They're gone. This one, from the outsider's perspective, doesn't look like that, and I think that's really healthy.
Well, let me ask a tough question. I've got a couple more that I want to build in here, but commercial and recreational fishing groups were really concerned about the MPA network, and their concerns existed around impacts, either to their way of making their living, or something that they cherish as a recreational pursuit. So has the network or the state, how are we engaging those groups to make sure that they're continuing to be able to play a role in assessing and shaping the network? Has this been a situation where those groups have sort of gone away, or are they actively engaged? And Meg, I'll put that to you.
I was going to say, Wade, you could answer this question probably better than I. I'll give you just some personal perspective on what I've seen, but honestly, I think you are in a better position to sort of remark on that question. And one is that in February of this year, it was the last trip I took. It was down to Santa Barbara, and it was for a celebration and award ceremony for the MPAs around the Northern Channel Islands. They were getting an international award for the implementation and results from that MPA network. And the people in the room who felt the most pride in what had been accomplished included recreational fishers, commercial fishermen and women, agency staff who had been very strong detractors in the early stages of the initiative and perhaps through the entire initiative process. And there were really eloquent remarks by them about what had been accomplished, and very little discussion of adverse impacts. And I don't know whether it wasn't the time and place for that, but I know that some studies have been done since, and the magnitude of impacts that had been projected just didn't materialize.
That's helpful. Steve, Megan, anything you want to add before I move on?
Just would note that those forecasts were always worst case impacts, and didn't account for any positive beneficial activity in terms of economic activity associated with MPAs, which I think was a flaw of the process of not really having better economic information to allow those trades.
Yeah, and I'll just add from the perspective of the resource agency. I mean, one of the secrets of success that Steve pointed out is truly science-based management and understandable science-based management. So as we enter in this decadal review, I think, our hypothesis has been that these protected areas can both revive the abundance of these fish with potentially positive impacts to stocks outside of the areas that then are helpful to those that rely on fishing. But that's a hypothesis, and we really need the science to help us understand what's happening, and then adaptively manage, however the science tells us. So what I also, often tell our friends in the commercial fishing industry is, again, this is not about declaring success or necessarily identifying what the next chapter of the MPAs are. Will there be others? Will they grow, et cetera? It's really, we have to look at the science and tell us and let the science guide what that says. And that could mean, change in any direction. There've been a couple questions around where to find more information about MPAs. And I'll just mention, if you actually go on wildlife.ca.gov, and you could do that by just typing in California Marine Protected Areas. That's the first thing that comes up is our Fish and Wildlife Department. You can find out more information about that. This YouTube session will also be archived on our Natural Resources Agency website as well, resources.ca.gov. We actually, as an indicator of the number of participants, I literally have dozens of questions that have flowed in, and some are to specific ones of you. So we'll probably, those that we don't get to here today, we'll send those to you directly. But I guess two questions with the time we have left. One, MPAs are happening in California. Lots of questions. Are they happening other places in the world? What, if so, where? If not, why not? And then recently we've seen these impacts to our coasts, including this massive die-off of the kelp forest from Central California up to the Oregon border. And are MPAs effectively situated to address that, or what else do we need to do? Two tough questions, open to any of you. Maybe to Steve, how unique is this network? And just as an objective observer, can this happen other places in the world? Is it already happening? If so, again, why not?
Well, there are clearly other system of MPAs associated with other states that have tried it, both on the West Coast and New England and Florida. And there's certainly numerous sets of MPAs elsewhere in the world. I think one of the unique things here is that it was created anew as a network, rather than sort of an accretion of different areas that occurred over time. I do think that some of the characteristics and that happened in California are hard to find elsewhere. I think mobilizing political will, which is one of the things the partnership did, and Resources Legacy Fund as an important bundler of the money, but not controller of its spending. One of the things they did is sort of work to support that. I think in many other places, the situation is much more polarized ideologically, and not just between the resource interest that was polarized in California, but between party and other forces like that. So I think in that case, it's just harder to imagine something of this scale, and nor are there the sort of background bundlers like Resources Legacy Fund, or as much philanthropic capacity that cared so much about California's resources elsewhere. So I think the answer is yes, it's occurring elsewhere, but they face some challenges that actually California had a leg up on.
Thanks for that. Meg or Megan, climate change and the impacts of the coast, including the kelp forests, do MPAs interact in that? Are there more work we have to do on coastal protection beyond MPAs? Thoughts?
I wanted to actually go back to your previous question very briefly, if that's okay.
Yeah.
There
as
are.
long as you answer the second question.
Oh yeah, I would like your answer to that too. There are just extraordinary examples globally of marine protected areas coming together through very collaborative processes. And I can just cite to a set of them that are being both funded and also assisted through the Waite Institute, for example. So you've got the Waite Foundation and the Waite Institute providing all the technical assistance and other support for local decision making. And they're taking a slightly different approach. They're basically coming in and talking about, well, there's an agreement with leadership that marine spatial planning is important to the future of these often small island states, big ocean states, and that they want to not just put marine protected areas in place, but they also want to look at the overall sort of ocean economy and ensure that the marine protected areas aren't harmed by other uses in and around the ocean, but that they also can have a very sustainable ocean-based economy. So they're really promising examples that take a different approach.
And you said if we wanted to find more information, it's called the WAVE Institute?
Waite, W-A-I-T-T. They've got a great website. Got
it. Thanks. So I'm not letting you off the hook for that climate change question.
Oh boy. Yeah, the conundrum with kelp die-offs. I was at a meeting over a year ago with many of your staff and academic experts and folks from up and down the state, and it really is horrifying to hear about what is happening with the kelp forests. I don't know that folks have really untangled the combination of causes or the solutions for addressing the kelp forest die-off. So I'm actually interested in the answer myself. And I'm wondering, Megan, have you seen this up in your region?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing, huge impacts to kelp, and other species, and sort of questioning what the impacts are from climate change and warmer oceans and that kind of thing. So, it's obviously this big question that we're sort of seeing the impacts on a species level, but really we all know those things are all interconnected, right? So that's sort of what my fear is sort of what's to come, right, from having those huge impacts to the kelp forests. So I'm really encouraged that the state and some NGOs are starting to try to look at that. Because a big piece seems just like lack of data, right, to really understand, what are those changes over time? And then also really thinking about, how traditional knowledge can play a role in really how things used to be, and, what are we really trying to get back to? I think that can provide some really good context to that as well, and what those changes are that people are seeing on a very local level, right?
Absolutely. And the way I describe it is MPAs are a tool in coastal protection, but they're a means, not the end. And our Ocean Protection Council, Mark Gold, Jen Eckerly, and others are really focused on trying, as Megan points out, to understand why these, redwoods of the coast, these beautiful, abundant kelp forests that are the basis of the ecosystem on the North Coast and Central Coast, why they're dying off, and how to address the purple urchin, which is an invasive species that has come in and created these urchin barrens. And so, as Megan pointed out, actually last week, and that publicly announced a really remarkable partnership with a nonprofit Reef Check and abalone divers to start doing work around getting rid of these purple urchin in certain areas, but then scientifically assessing the effectiveness of that, all towards trying to keep up with these changes to our coastal and ocean environment, and then taking action as Californians expect. We are nearly to the end of our time. This is a rich discussion, and we always try to balance how long we can keep people on the screen with the amazing interest in this. And again, dozens of questions that went unanswered. For those who ask questions, we will seek to follow up with you and connect you if we have your information to the right person. If you have a question and you want to make sure it's answered, you can email us at an email called secretary.suggestions@ca.resources.gov. Again, secretary.suggestions@resources.ca.gov. And we will connect you with the right person to answer your question. James, can you bring up our final slide? As we move to conclude our discussion, we just wanted to recognize the memory of one of our colleagues, Adrienne DeHood Fritz. We are now at the 1-year anniversary of the tragic sinking of the diving boat off Santa Cruz Island. And Adrienne and her fiance, Andrew, were among the victims. Adrienne led a remarkable life and was a critical member of the MPA team at the Ocean Protection Council. And before that, had done some remarkable research in Antarctica, as you see. So I think it's fitting that we conclude in her memory and the memory of all of those people that were enjoying and exploring the underground world of California's coasts. With that, let me thank Steve and Megan and Meg. Steve for spending 7 years of his life writing this book, which I think, speaking of durable, will be a durable contribution to our effort. Megan, for all your leadership, ensuring that actually tribal leaders and tribal communities are true partners to the state in the future of MPAs. And then Meg, for your steadfastness and your leadership from helping take MPAs as a concept to actually, a network of 124 underwater parks. Lastly, to everybody who tuned in, thanks for your engagement. Please do look for additional events of our Secretary of Speakers. And most importantly, given the state of where we're at, please be safe, protect yourself and others, wear a mask, and we will see you again soon.